자타공인이 많죠. 왜 그럴까요? 어렵지만 방법이 없는 건 생각들을
Welcome to We Day Han Stanford University. Today I want to talk about institutional capacity theory, and the basic argument here is that you can't have wealth unless you have stability. The first thing that we need to have is stability. Without stability, you'll never get wealth. Without wealth, you'll never get democracy. So if we look at institutional capacity theory, it really begins with Hobbes. And Hobbes was really inspired by the English Civil War. So the English Civil War, which took place in the 1640s, was a period of very great unrest in England. 200,000 people were killed at the end of the English Civil War. So Hobbes looks at this and says, wow, this is really bad. The worst thing that could possibly happen is that you could have a civil war, and if you do have a civil war, you're going to have disorder. You have many hundreds of thousands of people killed, and you will certainly not get any kind of economic growth. So Hobbes developed a theory, most famously in the Leviathan, in which Hobbes said, look, what you need is a strong sovereign. And basically what you've done as individuals in a community, you have agreed, you've signed a social contract to obey the law. And you'll obey the law under any circumstances, except if your own life is threatened, because then people run away, they're afraid. But as long as you are a member of a community, you signed a social contract and you basically agreed to obey the sovereign. So from this argument, you have the famous front piece of the Leviathan, which many of you may be familiar with, in which you have a sovereign whose body is made up by the people. That's the social contract. The sovereign has in his hand both ecclesiastical power and secular power. And the basic argument is that, in Hobbes, is that you have to obey the sovereign, regardless of what the sovereign says. And why does Hobbes write this? I say he writes this because he saw many hundreds of thousands of people killed in England in the 1640s, and he wanted to create a social theory in which, above all, you would have stability, and without stability, you have nothing. Life would be, without stability, life would be nasty, brutish, and short. So basically, institutional capacity theory is something that begins in the 17th century with Thomas Hobbes, who's well known. And probably the most important recent exponent of this theory is Samuel Huntington, who was a professor at Harvard University and wrote a book called Political Order and Changing Societies. And basically the argument here, and it was really very much an argument that was designed to be an alternative to modernization theory, is that things can go up, but things might also go down. Things get better, but things might also get worse. What basically modernization theory says is that institutional growth and technological change is kind of automatic. You know, what institutional capacity theory says is that you're not going to get those things unless you have a strong and stable state. Look at the world in, say, 1800. Maybe there was, a 4-to-1 difference in per capita income between, say, the UK and India, say. If you look at the world today in 2021, the differences between countries that are wealthy and countries that are poor is much larger than 4-to-1. So there are much bigger changes now. So there's no automaticity to technological change, which is what modernization theory says. What institutional capacity says is you're not going to get technological change unless you have stability. If you have a lot of people moving to cities, a lot of people that are becoming more literate, a lot of people that are becoming wealthier, if you don't have institutions accompanying that, you can end up being worse off. So you can have institutional decay. Huntington's famous formula was social mobilization and institutional decay leads to political decay. You'll have disorder, you'll have disruption, you'll have disorder. Nobody believes this. Many Americans thought they believed in modernization theory, they believed in population growth, they believed in technological change. They believed that things would get better all over the world, not only in North America, but also in Africa. All right, so here's what I think about Afghanistan, which we're seeing in front of us every day today. The United States, I think modernization theory has really affected American policy. So I think the problem with the United States has been this. I think we could actually be very successful if you thought about combating terrorism. If you think about introducing democracy and wealth, it's not something that happens automatically. And institutional capacity is not something that happens automatically. And the fact that you're there doesn't mean that it will happen.
The system of the government is clear. That is an Islamic government. Sharia law would be, of course, there would be no democratic system at all because it doesn't have any base in our country.
All right, the question then becomes, where do we get institutional capacity from? And here there's no agreement in the literature. So the most famous argument about institutional capacity is an argument that says war makes the state and the state makes war. And the most famous example here is an example that was given by Charles Tilly. Charles Tilly was an historical sociologist at Columbia, and Tilly was basically looking at Central Europe. If you look at Prussia, I mean, here you have a country in the middle of Central Europe. It has no natural boundaries. It's not surrounded by mountains. It's not surrounded by rivers. The mountains are relatively low. The only high mountains in Europe are the Alps, which is south of Germany. The rivers, even the Rhine, even the major rivers, were rivers that could be forded. And Tilly said, look, the Prussians realized that if they didn't succeed in building a strong state and a strong army, they were going to be conquered. If you look at East Asia, you look at the Warring States period of China, it ends in something like 221 BC. There were several different states within China. Finally, one of the dynasties in China succeeded in conquering the other dynasties in China. You developed a strong state. The strong state ruled over not all of modern China, but much of China. So if you look at it, for any of you that have visited Xi'an and have seen the terracotta warriors, now it's true that the first dynasty in China didn't last very long, but the Chinese emperor had the terracotta warriors created. There were something like 8,000. They're amazing. Each of the warriors is different. There were hundreds of chariots also buried along with him. The Emperor of China felt that he had been able to demonstrate that by building a strong state and a powerful army, he would be able to conquer all of China. And he created an empire. He didn't create a dynasty that lasted, but he did clearly create an empire that lasted. So certainly the most well-known argument for where you get state capacity is this argument about state capacity comes from war. War comes from being vulnerable. So having a strong state is allows you to have a strong army, and having a strong army allows you to defend yourself. A second set of arguments is that institutional capacity comes from the demands of a larger middle class. And certainly one place where this argument has been applied is the United States after the Civil War. Civil War ended in 1864. In the period after that, you have the development of railways, you have the development of major American universities, including the University of California, the University of Michigan, Cornell University, the land-grant colleges. And the argument is that the United States, after the Civil War, you get a larger middle class, it becomes a wealthier country. The larger middle class demands better services. This demand for better services led to a larger state and a larger and more efficient state. The United States after the Civil War is not the only place this has been applied to. If you look at the contemporary period, think about Somaliland, which is a part of Somalia. Most of Somalia is a chaotic place. Somaliland is a small part of Somalia. It's broken off from the rest of the country. And the argument is that it's basically, you have a large middle class, you have lots of traders, it's along the Red Sea. They've demanded that the state be more efficient, and you have higher levels of development and a more modern economy, more modern society, more institutional capacity, and a stronger army. So from the United States after the Civil War to Somaliland in the contemporary period, you have a situation in which this large middle class seems to be demanding a larger state, and a larger state is able to develop a more effective army. A third argument for you have those two arguments for where institutional capacity comes from. One is that it comes from the threat of war. The second is it comes from a larger middle class. A final argument, and it's one which I've only seen applied actually to Prussia, is that institutional capacity comes from religion. And the argument here is that what happened in Prussia in the 17th century was not only that they were threatened, but the ruler of Prussia hired Calvinists to run his bureaucracy. These Calvinists were more interested in being right with God than anything else. And being right with God meant that you had to do your job well. Doing your job well meant that you were working hard for the king. So you had a strong bureaucracy because the members of the bureaucracy were not out to feed themselves, but they were driven by religion. So I think this religious argument, especially this argument about Calvinism, is another argument for why you might have institutional capacity. Finally, there's an argument, and this is one that comes mainly from me. You might have exceptional leaders. That's certainly the story in the United States. The founding fathers, Lincoln during the Civil War was certainly no Democrat, arrested lots of people. Genghis Khan, there's an argument about Genghis Khan as a lawgiver. In the contemporary period, there's an argument about Paul Kagame, who is the president of Rwanda. And the argument here is that these are exceptional people. They actually made the right decisions. They developed stronger states. You're not going to have stability unless you have a strong state. You have to have a strong state. So all of these are arguments which account for why you have higher levels of wealth, higher levels of democracy, a stronger state, but there is no consensus in the literature about where a stronger state actually comes from. So maybe it comes from war makes a state and state makes war, which is an argument that we're most familiar with. Maybe it comes by having a larger middle class, which demands a more effective state. Maybe it comes from exceptional leaders. Maybe it comes from religion. The argument here is the central argument is that for institutional capacity, is that if you want to have economic development, if you want to have greater wealth, you've got to have institutional capacity. And institutional capacity only comes at certain periods of time And it may come from a variety of different sources, but without it, you're definitely going to be stuck. So whether institutional capacity comes from being threatened by other states or it comes from having exceptional leaders, you absolutely have to have institutional capacity to make things work.